Hi folks, it's Jake here at Canadian Cutting Edge, and this is a video just about what I keep talking about, thickness of the edge behind the grind. A lot of people don't seem to quite understand what I'm talking about, and I also want to do this video so that other reviewers can just watch this one thing and hopefully understand why I'm talking about the thickness behind the grind and why it's a good idea for them to start talking about the thickness behind the grind. So if you want to know anything about that, stick around for this little talk. First thing that I want to mention is, how do I measure the thickness behind the grind? Well, I take my caliper and I turn it on and I go to my knife and I go to the edge here and I, squeeze it and I measure how thick it is behind the grind. So I'm measuring with the tip of the calipers and I'm trying to measure right there. So I'm measuring right at that spot right there. That's the thickness behind the grind. So here's the grind and that's behind it. And that's an important measurement. The thickness behind the grind is a significant determining factor on how well a knife will cut. This diagram here is, I've got this knife here. And if I look at it from this angle, I got the knife and I just cut it off. I didn't have to on this because it's a fro. And so these pieces of paper are this on this angle like that. So that should not be hard to understand. I just had to include that depending on, well, I've got no idea who's going to watch this video, right? So what do we have here? I got two samples of the thickness behind the grind. I cut it out of this paper here. So it's like I've got one here. There's the knife, thickness behind the grind. So, that should cut pretty well. This is a 20-degree angle, which is very common in sportsman's knives, outdoor knives, stuff like that. So if that's going to cut pretty well, how well will this cut? It's the exact same rate of bevel. Pretend this is a full flat grind and this is the bevel on it. It's exactly the same. It's just that this one is thicker behind the grind than this one. So if I'm trying to cut through something and I want to get through it like that, which is going to get through easier? It's not that hard. This isn't rocket science. Of course, this one's going to go through more easily than this one. It's not going to go through a piece of wood, but whatever it is. And that's even though, the very tip here is identical on both of them. And that's because it's not just the tip that does any work when you're cutting through things. The bevel does some work as well, especially the thicker stuff that you cut through. That's why on a knife like this, you get all these scratches all over the side. Because when you're cutting through something, the sides are making contact as well as the cutting edge. So when you're cutting through something, it's not just the tip itself that goes and does all the work. The shoulder of the grind, the final grind, does some of the work. That's these areas. The tip does the brunt of the work, but these areas do work as well. And the bevel itself does some of the work. Now, which is going to be easier and which is going to have less work? So the work that the shoulder of the final grind and the shoulder of the bevel are doing are actually fighting against the work that the tip's doing. This is creating friction along the side of what you're cutting through, making it more difficult to go through the item. So that's why you need to find the optimal thickness behind the grind for the thing that you are cutting. Because you don't want to have way more friction than's necessary. But if you have if you have it too thin, then you're creating a weakness in the steel, which gives you a worse set of problems. The smaller goes through more easily. But there's other factors involved as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on why thinner isn't always better. Just everything you cut through, when it goes through the edge, it rubs on the sides, and the thinner it is right behind the grind, the more easily it'll start going through that bevel. In other words, it doesn't have to go through this 20-degree angle as far before it gets some relief and has an easier time over here. So the blade's going through something, and it's just a little more easier to get through. Let's do it this way. It's just a little bit more easier to get through and then push through when it's narrower. So you just have to do that wide part for a while, and then it's got less resistance per distance traveled. So for every inch that this knife goes, it's easier because it goes more slowly to spread apart whatever it's cutting through. So if it has to go through this final bevel for a longer distance, that's a little bit harder. Again, remember, this is 20 degrees on each side. They are identical. Put those together right there. It's the exact same bevel. One's just wider than the other. So I was talking about it earlier, thinner's not always better, and that's because thinner means less strength in here. You've got whatever thickness of steel you have here across, you have less of it here. You know, you're the same distance away from the tip, but you've got less distance, which means this is weaker than this. If the grind is quite thin, that means you can cut through more delicate things. If you're cutting through robust things like wood, batoning or something, then you need more thickness because you need the strength so that it doesn't break on you. Because if a tip bends and rolls over and stuff, now, you know, if that bent and rolled over and got wrecked, I'm being over dramatic, now I'm going to have to grind it down to here. And now my thickness behind the grind is this thickness instead of this thickness. So I don't want to break it because then I'm going to turn my knife into this. So what I have to do is use the right knife for the right job. But to do that, I need to know what the job is. And I need to make sure I buy the knife that has the thickness behind the grind that will do the work that I want it to do. So knife enthusiasts, and especially knife reviewers, it'd be in your best interest if you would take the time to learn this stuff, get familiar with what thickness behind the grind works best with what size of knife and for what type of work. For example, kitchen knives are usually thinner behind the grind, and they have even a more narrow angle. They've got a 15-degree angle on each side, so 30 instead of 40. And that's because they're always cutting soft stuff. Well, not always, but almost always. And you'll find that if you get a cleaver, it's going to be back to the 20-degree angle because it might have to go through some bone and stuff. And so there's so many variety and so many options here. So it is a bunch of stuff to learn, but it's important to learn it all. Now, talking about sporting knives, like what you see here, this is what I'm called sporting knives, folding knives and fixed blades. Just a rough estimate, something around 2.5 inches, you wanted about 0.4 millimeters. Something 3 inches to 4 inches, you wanted about 0.5, maybe 0.55 millimeters behind the grind. Something over 4 inches, to 5 inches or so, you probably want 0.65 millimeters behind the grind. And not much more than that on any regular folding knife. And then when you get to great big fixed blade knives, you don't want to go over 1 millimeter. In fact, I think you probably don't want to go over 0.8 of a millimeter. You just don't need to go so super thick because the steels these days are robust enough that they don't need to be that thick in order to have the strength that they need to keep from, failing and rolling over and folding and breaking. Too thin, you break your knife and you end up having to create a thicker blade out of the knife. So if you need a thicker knife, start with a thicker knife. If you have a thin knife, don't do hard work with it because it won't last. And that's why you keep going thinner for lighter work and more delicate work, and you go thicker and more robust for bigger work. This is true of flat grinds and hollow grinds. I would have to do a different video to talk about Scandi grinds. And, there's a couple other things out there too. So just the hollow grinds and flat grinds. Saber grinds are a version of a flat grind. So full flat, saber, and hollow grinds. These are the kinds of grinds I'm talking about in this video. So a cut test like paper, that's only using the very tip of the blade. That's cutting just with that little tip there, and it doesn't have these sides, these bevels don't really have a role to play. Those things play a role on things that are three-dimensional. Well, I know paper's three-dimensional technically, but it's effectively so thin that it doesn't really have an effect on these edges. It's about thicker stuff. If you're cutting a carrot, peeling a potato, anything, cutting an apple, whittling some wood, all those kinds of things, these thicknesses behind the grind make a dramatic difference on how it will perform. And so if a reviewer just does paper cut tests, there's a huge realm of information that is being totally overlooked. And it might cut paper really well, but it might be terrible for the task that you're buying it for. There you go. If you've got any questions, put it in the comments below. If I find that I'm getting a lot of questions and I just didn't explain it really well, I might just delete this video and redo it. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for liking, commenting, sharing, subscribing, all that good stuff. Just one other little note. This weekend, I'm going to go on a trip to visit my grandchildren. So they're like 2 hours drive away. So I may or may not have a full slate of videos this weekend. Be that as it may. By this weekend, I'm talking about, September 24th, 25th, whatever the numbers are. I'll put it on the screen. So thanks for watching again. Remember, always cut towards your chum and not your thumb.